There are some truths that you only find the courage to speak after a few drinks. You should never worry about embarrassing yourself, because you never know how destiny will bring the right person into your life. I ended up getting completely wasted at a party with my friends and started clinging to a female police officer who was on duty. I was all over her, making her face turn bright red, but she simply could not escape my drunken embrace. When I saw the video evidence later, I was absolutely mortified and wondered if I was even acting like a human being. It all started when we were out celebrating my buddy getting into a relationship, and I decided to order a Long Island iced tea. That drink really did a number on me. After only half a glass, I was still standing, but I had completely lost my mind. I started wailing about being single and even made a bet with my friend that I would find a girlfriend before the night was over. What followed was a series of actions so shameful that they will haunt me for the rest of my life. I stumbled out onto the street and scanned the crowd for any woman standing alone, eventually spotting the most beautiful one and trotting right up to her. The woman I chose happened to be a traffic officer on duty. She was tall and fit, with a very commanding presence. She was busy writing a ticket for a driver when I decided to interrupt her. Out of nowhere, I approached her and stared into her eyes with a look of pure desperation. My eyes were welling up with tears, making me look incredibly pathetic. The officer was initially very patient and was about to ask if I needed any assistance. Suddenly, I opened my mouth and weakly asked if she would be my girlfriend. The driver getting the ticket and my group of friends were all completely stunned by my audacity. Sarah looked absolutely shocked, and all the professional concern she had prepared for a citizen vanished instantly. She stammered that it probably wasn't a very good idea. My eyes filled with tears as I began to sob and complain. I asked her what was wrong with me and if she thought I wasn't handsome enough. I started shouting about how I was tall with a great build and an 8-pack, yet I was still single. My friend Jake later told me that I spoke so fast he didn't even have a chance to stop me. I argued that the police are supposed to serve the public, and since I was in such great distress, she was obligated to help me out. I told her that she had to agree to be mine, or I would have to take her by force. I stood there with my hands on my hips, staring at her with stubborn determination. Sarah didn't know whether to laugh or cry as she warned me that assaulting an officer was a serious crime. The thought of being rejected made me feel even more miserable, so I lunged forward and threw my arms around her. I clung to her and refused to let go. I remember thinking how soft her shoulders felt even though they weren't very broad. She had such a clean and fresh scent, and I felt like I was in some kind of dream. I kept hugging her and refused to let her go, completely losing track of where I was. At that point, I had drifted into a total drunken stupor and ignored everything happening around me. I completely ignored my friends who were doubled over with laughter and the pedestrians who were watching in total shock. You truly should never underestimate the bold and crazy things a drunk person is capable of doing. Sarah's face was crimson as she tried to peel me off her like I was some kind of human octopus. She didn't really know where to grab me, and her initial attempts to push me away were completely useless. Eventually, she looked at my friends with a pleading expression for help. My buddies were laughing so hard they could barely catch their breath, so it took them a moment to step in. It took the combined effort of several people to finally pull me away from her. Even as they were dragging me away, I kept trying to lunge back toward her every chance I got. I did this several times before they finally managed to haul me off for good. I kept crying and reaching out my hands, shouting that we were soulmates and shouldn't be separated. The entire street was in chaos, filled with the loud laughter of everyone watching the spectacle. Sarah was left standing there with a bright red face and a wrinkled uniform, breathing heavily with sweat on her forehead. Anyone walking by would have thought she had just survived a brutal physical struggle. I only learned about all of these details from Jake's very vivid and animated description the next day. Even though I had absolutely no memory of the event, the secondhand embarrassment was strong enough to make me want to hide forever. I woke up the next morning feeling like a train had hit me, only to see my roommate, Jake Sullivan, grinning right in my face. He had this weirdly satisfied look on his face that left me feeling completely bewildered. He asked me if I remembered anything from the previous night. I clutched my throbbing head and admitted that I had no recollection of what happened after the first few drinks. He burst into a loud, obnoxious laugh and started describing my antics in great detail before showing me the video evidence. After watching the footage, I sat there in stunned silence, wondering how I could have possibly done something so ridiculous. The video showed a very intoxicated young man throwing himself at a female officer in the middle of a busy street. The intensity of my behavior was shocking to witness. If my face wasn't so clearly visible in the video, I would have accused Jake of pulling a cruel prank on me. Jake told me that he never realized I could be so bold and aggressive. He went on, using all sorts of colorful words to describe how shocked everyone was by my performance. He shoved his phone in my face to make sure I saw every single embarrassing detail. He pointed out how beautiful the officer was and even noted the moment I accidentally wiped my nose on her clean uniform. I couldn't understand how they managed to film the whole thing while laughing so hard they could barely breathe. I realized they probably just wanted to keep a record of my most humiliating moment to play back whenever they felt like it. I tried my best to remember the night, but my memory completely cut off after that Long Island iced tea. However, as I thought about it more, a few blurry fragments began to resurface in my mind. I vaguely remembered singing at the top of my lungs about loneliness and heartbreaks. Then I recalled giving Jake a huge hug and telling him I hoped he would have a long and happy marriage with many children. I also remembered sobbing on his shoulder and asking him why I was destined to be alone forever. Jake seemed moved by my tears and promised that he would introduce me to an amazing woman. I apparently told him that I didn't need his help and that I would find someone on my own that very night. That stupid drunken bet was what led to the infamous scene of me harassing a police officer in public. I felt like crying from sheer shame of it all. Jake mentioned that a huge crowd gathered to watch the spectacle, making them want to disappear from embarrassment. He told me I was lucky that I couldn't remember a single second of it. I had truly reached a new peak of humiliation, but at least I didn't have to live with the memory. However, Jake's expression suddenly shifted, giving me a very bad feeling about what he was going to say next. He told me that I was actually responsible for a traffic accident that occurred while I was making a scene. My heart, which was already racing, felt like it was about to stop completely from the shock. I swallowed hard and asked Jake to tell me exactly what happened during that disastrous night. It turned out that the story was even more ridiculous than I had imagined. The officer I had clung to was in the middle of a traffic stop when I interrupted her. The driver she had pulled over was just about to leave when I stumbled onto the scene and started begging her to be my girlfriend. My aggressive display of affection left the driver completely mesmerized by the drama. Instead of driving away, he stayed put and watched the whole thing unfold through his car window with a fascinated expression. A crowd soon gathered, and other drivers even pulled over to see what was going on. It seems that human curiosity is a universal trait that transcends age and gender. Everyone loves a good show, and I was providing a great one. One of the drivers was so distracted by my antics that he failed to pay attention to the car in front of him. He ended up rear-ending the vehicle, creating a whole new traffic accident right there on the street. According to Jake, Sarah had to deal with the fender bender immediately after my friends dragged me away. Apparently, the two drivers got into a massive argument, and neither of them was willing to back down. Jake pointed out that while nobody was hurt, I had harassed her for quite a while and made her job much harder. He suggested that it would probably be a good idea for me to go and offer her a sincere apology. I thought about it for a second and realized he was right, but I still didn't want to do it. The thought of showing my face at the police station to apologize was incredibly daunting. Jake reminded me that Sarah had been extremely patient with me and hadn't even arrested me for harassment. He told me that I at least owed her some kind of gesture of appreciation for her kindness. Jake got all excited and told me that she was actually incredibly attractive. He encouraged me to go for it, suggesting that maybe next month we would be celebrating my new relationship. I begged him to leave me alone and let me wallow in my shame in peace. I flatly refused to go and then asked him who filmed that video so I could get it deleted. My main priority was getting rid of that humiliating video since I had no memory of the event itself. I figured that as long as there was no footage, I could just pretend that nothing ever happened. However, the situation found me before I could hide. My phone rang, and when I answered, a polite woman with a hint of a smile in her voice asked if she was speaking with Morrison Miller. I confirmed my identity, and she explained that she was calling from the Seattle Traffic Department. She told me that there was a traffic incident involving me, and that I needed to come down to discuss it with the drivers. I felt like my entire world was falling apart as I hung up the phone. I had never heard of anything so ridiculous, and the situation seemed completely beyond belief. I eventually left the house with a miserable expression, prepared to face whatever punishment awaited me. I didn't even bother to get dressed up, leaving the house with a pale, hungover face and messy hair. When we arrived at the precinct, the officer at the desk told us to wait for the person in charge of the case. Jake was standing next to me with a glint in his eye, wondering aloud if it would be the same officer from the night before. The officer behind the desk laughed and confirmed that it was indeed the same woman. She teased me, saying that I had better keep my hands to myself this time unless I wanted to be charged with a crime. I was horrified to realize that my drunken behavior was already common knowledge at the station. After waiting for a while, I decided to stop a young officer to ask how much longer it would be. He was a young, clean-cut officer who looked like he had just started the job. Before I could even finish my sentence, his face turned bright red, and he blurted out that he already had a girlfriend. He actually backed away from me, as if I were a threat to his relationship. I was stunned because I only wanted to ask about the mediation, and I couldn't care less about his dating life. I stood there with my mouth open for a few seconds before I finally understood what he was implying. Feeling completely defeated, I walked back to Jake and decided to just wait in silence. Jake pointed out that my reputation had clearly preceded me throughout the entire department. I felt like my life was essentially over at that point. After wallowing in my misery for a few minutes, a woman walked through the front doors. It was a crisp autumn day, and she brought in a subtle, pleasant scent with her. She was wearing a casual hoodie and was breathtakingly beautiful. She looked like she could be a professional model with perfectly balanced features. She carried herself with an incredible amount of poise and authority, commanding respect just by standing there. The moment our eyes met, my heart skipped a beat, and I couldn't look away. I felt like I had seen her somewhere before, which was strange because I definitely would have remembered a woman that attractive. To my surprise, she actually turned a bit red when she looked at me. Suddenly, a blurry memory flashed in my head of her face being only inches away from mine. I remembered her face being flushed and being close enough to see the fine details of her skin and her long eyelashes. I could even recall the sensation of her warm breath against my skin. She had a very clean and invigorating scent that I couldn't forget. She looked a bit awkward and had a shy smile on her face as she glanced at me with eyes that seemed almost watery with embarrassment. It hit me like a ton of bricks as I realized exactly who she was. She was the officer I had been clinging to and harassing the night before. I felt a wave of intense guilt wash over me. Aside from the guilt, I was suddenly very aware of the fact that I looked like a total mess with my pale face and messy hair. I couldn't believe I was standing in front of this stunning woman looking so unkempt. I felt like I couldn't breathe from the sheer awkwardness of the situation. She had been walking quickly, but she slowed her pace as she approached me and asked if I was Morrison. Jake immediately raised his hand and confirmed our identity with a big grin. She cleared her throat and regained her professional composure, introducing herself as Sarah Thompson. She looked incredibly elegant and professional, as if the events of the previous night had never even happened. However, I noticed her eyes darting away whenever we made eye contact, which revealed her underlying embarrassment. Seeing her like that only made me feel more guilty about whatever trauma I had caused her. I started to offer a serious apology, but Jake cut me off before I could finish. Jake suddenly announced that he had to leave and asked Sarah to look after me. He told her that I'd been feeling terrible about my behavior the night before and was completely racked with guilt. He reminded me to read the apology letter I had prepared and gave me a suggestive wink as if he were trying to set us up. Before I could say anything, he turned around and vanished out the door. Jake was always such an optimist, but I was far too embarrassed to even think about flirting with her. Sarah then began to explain the reason why she had requested my presence at the station. The two drivers from the accident had been arguing all night, each blaming the other for being distracted by the spectacle I was making. Eventually, they both agreed that I was the one truly at fault for the whole thing. I couldn't believe they were blaming me for their own lack of attention while watching the drama. As we approached the mediation room, I could hear a massive argument raging inside. I tried to psych myself up to enter the room, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Sarah noticed my hesitation and stopped, asking me with a smirk if I was finally starting to feel embarrassed. She gave me a playful little smile that made my heart race even faster than before. I wondered if she had any idea how incredibly charming she looked when she smiled like that. She looked so strong and professional when she was serious, but her smile had a much softer quality to it. I admitted that I was embarrassed and told her that I genuinely didn't remember anything from the night before because of that drink. She told me not to worry because it was only a minor accident and promised to help mediate the situation. I was touched by how kind and professional she was being despite how poorly I had treated her. I looked at her with tears in my eyes, feeling incredibly grateful for her patience. Inside the room, two large men were yelling at each other at the top of their lungs, arguing about who was more distracted by the gossip. They kept going in circles, returning to the same argument over and over again. I felt like I was watching a ridiculous soap opera and just wanted them to stop shouting. One of them shouted about how a person could possibly behave the way I did. The other man countered that people do crazy things when they are drunk and shared a weird story about his own uncle. I couldn't help but laugh and asked if they had been at it for long. Sarah sighed and told me that she had been trying to get them to calm down for quite some time without any luck. I realized they were about to start the whole argument all over again, so I finally gathered my courage and burst into the room. I shouted that it was all my fault and that I never should have ordered that Long Island iced tea. I told them that if I hadn't made a scene, they never would have had anything to look at. I offered to pay for the damages, though I immediately regretted the offer and clutched my wallet tightly. I silently prayed that they were both driving very cheap cars. The two men went silent and stared at me, looking relieved that the person they were blaming had finally shown up. I bowed deeply and apologized over and over again to the two drivers. I tried to look as pale and vulnerable as possible, making sure they could see the guilt and pain on my face. Sarah looked surprised by my dramatic display for a moment before getting back to work. The two men were tough, but they seemed to soften up when they saw how miserable I looked, eventually telling me to just be more careful with my drinking. I kept nodding my head in agreement, looking as humble as I possibly could. While the men weren't looking, Sarah actually gave me a quiet thumbs up. Both cars were insured, but the driver of the luxury car in front insisted that the insurance payout wouldn't be enough. The driver in the back refused to take full responsibility, arguing that the driver in front shouldn't have been stopped to watch the drama. They couldn't agree on anything, which was why they had insisted on bringing me into the discussion. When they saw a young guy like me standing there and sincerely admitting my mistakes, the two men actually started to feel a little bad for me. Sarah stepped in and took a firm stance, telling them that if they didn't settle, she would have to file a formal report. She pointed out that under the circumstances, the accident would officially have nothing to do with me. Eventually, the two men reached an agreement to settle the matter privately between themselves. One of them warned me to be more careful with my drinking in the future, mentioning how alcohol can lead to all sorts of trouble. He told me to take a good look at the poor officer I had harassed and insisted that I owe her a proper apology. I quickly nodded my head and promised that I would do exactly that. Sarah cleared her throat and politely ushered the two men out of the room. Once they were gone, I let out a sigh of relief and realized that I was starving since I'd skipped breakfast. I felt my face grow even paler and my legs started to feel a bit weak. Sarah noticed how miserable I looked and walked over to ask if I was feeling all right. I tried to act tough and told her I still had to read my apology letter to her. However, I suddenly felt dizzy and almost fell over, but Sarah was quick enough to grab my arm and steady me. I was surprised by how strong she felt even though she was wearing a casual hoodie. I felt my face heat up and quickly pulled away, thanking her for the help. Sarah's supervisor walked over and gave me a stern lecture about my inappropriate behavior. He told me that harassing an officer is a serious offense and that they were going to use my situation as a training case for the department. He said that in the future, officers would be trained to use a shoulder throw to neutralize someone behaving like I did. I just nodded along, feeling mortified that my most embarrassing moment was now a training manual for the police. After he finished lecturing me, he turned his attention to Sarah and criticized her for being too lenient. He warned her that if I had been someone with truly bad intentions, her hesitation could have been very dangerous. His tone was quite harsh, and I could see Sarah looking down as she took the criticism. I couldn't stand seeing her get in trouble, so I decided to intervene and change the subject. I pulled out my embarrassing apology letter and told the supervisor that I was the only one to blame for the situation. I insisted that I had prepared a formal written apology to make things right. The supervisor seemed impressed by my attitude and told me that a formal reading wasn't necessary. However, I insisted that I needed to read it to properly demonstrate how truly sorry I was. I had put a lot of effort into writing it during the ride over, and I didn't want my work to go to waste. I stood there and read the apology statement with as much emotion and sincerity as I could muster. The supervisor sat in front of me while Sarah stood by my side, making me feel like a child being disciplined in front of his parents. I began reading about how alcohol had hijacked my brain and forced me to behave in such an unacceptable manner. I read about how ashamed I was for disrespecting a dedicated officer who works to keep the community safe. As I spoke, I caught a glimpse of Sarah and noticed that her face was turning a lovely shade of red. I went on about how heartbroken I was over my actions, even though they weren't intentional. An older officer nearby actually sputtered on his tea when he heard my overly dramatic words. Sarah seemed to be getting used to my dramatic nature and just watched me with a faint smile on her face. I was so distracted by her beauty that I almost forgot my lines and ended the reading by pretending to wipe away tears. The supervisor finally cut me off and told me that they understood my remorse. He gave me some fatherly advice about drinking responsibly and gave me a look that seemed to imply he knew more than he was saying. I stood up too quickly when we were done and felt a sudden wave of dizziness. I was about to fall when someone caught me, and I realized it was Sarah as her familiar, comforting scent washed over me. She asked if I was all right, and although I said I was fine, I didn't pull away from her. I told her that I had low blood sugar and hadn't had a chance to eat anything before rushing over to the station. Her supervisor suggested that she should walk me out since I had been so sincere in my apology. He noted that since she was off duty, she might even be able to give me a ride if she was going in the same direction. I realized that was why she wasn't in uniform when she arrived. I felt even more guilty knowing that my actions had forced her to come into work on her day off. I tried to be considerate and told her that she didn't have to give me a ride if it was out of her way. She insisted that it was fine and offered to take me home anyway. I was expecting us to walk out to a police motorcycle, but she led me to a beautiful, shiny BMW instead. I stood there in surprise for a moment and asked her where the motorcycle was. She laughed and told me that she couldn't use a department vehicle for personal business. Her smile was so beautiful that it actually made my legs feel a little weak as I looked into her bright eyes. Sarah sat perfectly upright as she drove, looking completely focused and professional. I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, my heart racing as I tried to think of something to say to break the tension. She noticed that I still looked a little pale and asked if I was feeling okay. She suggested that I should get some food immediately and offered to drop me off at a restaurant nearby. I took the opportunity and told her that I really did feel like I needed to eat something. I suggested that I should take her out to lunch as a way to make up for my terrible behavior the night before. I pleaded with her to give me a chance to make things right, saying that I wouldn't be able to sleep until I had properly apologized. She eventually agreed, and we headed to a small cafe to grab some lunch. I thanked her for taking the time to help me, even though it was her day off. She gave me a polite response about serving the community while maintaining her incredibly poised and dignified posture. Looking at her, I realized that despite my drunken idiocy, I actually had very good taste in women. I couldn't stop staring at her even as I was busy eating my lunch. Eventually, she noticed me staring and asked if there was something on her face. I told her that she was just so beautiful that it was actually making my food taste better. I immediately regretted saying something so bold, thinking she would find me annoying, but she actually started to blush. She quickly regained her composure and told me to focus on my meal. I thanked her again for her help with the mediation and told her she saved me a lot of money. After talking for a while, I managed to get her iMessage by telling her it would be easier to reach me if anything else came up with the case. The ride to the station had felt like an eternity, but I found myself wishing that the drive home would never end. I actually started hoping for a bit of traffic, just so I could spend more time with her. As I was about to get out of the car, I asked her why she had called me in for mediation if I wasn't officially responsible for the accident. She hesitated for a moment before explaining that having everyone present usually makes the mediation process go much smoother and faster. I nodded as I thought about her answer and headed back to my apartment. Jake was waiting for me and immediately started badgering me for details about how the meeting went. Jake told me he didn't care about the money and wanted to know if I had made any progress with Sarah. I told him that I had managed to get her number, but didn't think I had any reason to talk to her again. Jake was convinced that her giving me her number was a great sign and told me to be more confident. He joked that I should use some of that same aggressive energy I had shown the night before to win her over. He reminded me that I was the only single person in our friend group and told me that I needed to be more bold. He said if I had shown even half that much confidence in the past, he wouldn't have to worry about my dating life. I didn't care about anyone else because Sarah was the only woman I could think about. From the moment I saw her, I knew that I wasn't going to be interested in anyone else. Jake gave me a reassuring pat on the shoulder and promised to help me come up with a plan to win her over. Once I agreed, he immediately started brainstorming ideas on how I should proceed. He even managed to find out exactly which intersection she was assigned to for her shifts. I was stunned by his research skills and asked him how he could possibly know that information. Jake just gave me a cool smile and told me he had used all his connections to help me out. He then made a suggestive comment about how stunning she was and told me I would be a fool to let her go. I gave him a frustrated look before retreating to my bedroom to be alone with my thoughts. I lay down on my soft bed, but I couldn't stop thinking about the feeling of holding her the night before. I remembered how soft she felt during our brief encounter on the street. It was strange how my memories were slowly coming back, and I could still recall her scent and the way she felt in my arms. I couldn't stop thinking about her and the way her warm breath felt against my skin. I realized that I was completely smitten with her, so I headed out to her intersection the very next morning. It was a very busy intersection with a lot of traffic and pedestrians, making it a perfect spot for an officer to be stationed. Following Jake's advice, I decided to try and make a good impression by doing some kind acts in the area. I figured that as an officer, she would value someone who was kind and helpful to others. She looked stunning as she stood in the middle of the intersection, her tall frame perfectly complemented by her professional uniform. She stood as straight as a tree, radiating a sense of energy and purpose. From where I was standing, I had a perfect view of her beautiful profile. I stayed in the crowd and just enjoyed watching her work from a distance. I ended up crossing the street about 20 times, but I couldn't find a single person who actually needed my help. There weren't any kids who needed help either, and certainly no one was lost. I didn't get to do a single good deed, and I was starting to feel completely worn out from all the walking. A little kid in a school uniform eventually came up and asked me why I kept crossing back and forth. I gave him a playful answer, telling him that I was just working on my future happiness. His mother immediately grabbed him and hurried away as if I were some kind of threat. I could hear her lecturing him about the dangers of talking to strange men as they disappeared into the distance. She told him that he should never talk to weird people on his way to school. The kid asked her if even handsome guys could be weirdos, which made me feel both complimented and insulted at the same time. After about an hour of this, I realized I had to get to work. I took one last look at Sarah and said a silent goodbye, wondering if she had even noticed me standing there. Jake laughed his head off when I told him about my failed attempts to be a hero. I sat on the couch and started picking petals off a plant, trying to figure out if she had seen me or not. Jake yelled at me to stop ruining the plant and snatched it away from me. I stubbornly told him that even if I was just another person in the crowd to her, I was going to be the most memorable one. I went back to the intersection the next morning, making sure to dress my best and even put on a bit of concealer. Unfortunately, Sarah wasn't there, and I figured she must have been assigned to a different shift. I didn't let it get me down and decided to keep trying every single day. I kept up this routine for an entire week, going there before and after work, and I actually ended up losing a few pounds from all the walking. I eventually got my chance to talk to her again, though the circumstances were much more embarrassing than I had hoped for. I was back at the intersection on Saturday morning just to catch a glimpse of her. I hadn't eaten anything all morning, and I suddenly started to feel very lightheaded and dizzy. I saw another officer approaching to take over her shift, so I realized she was about to leave. I decided to make my move and started walking toward her as she headed toward the sidewalk. I must have overexerted myself, because after a few steps, my vision went dark and I started to collapse. I thought I was going to hit the pavement, but I ended up falling against someone very soft instead. I looked up to see Sarah's beautiful face, her eyes filled with concern as she asked me if I was all right. The sun was shining behind her, giving her a soft and radiant glow that made her look like an angel. My heart was pounding in my chest because this was the first time I was actually aware of her being so close to me. I felt like I was in the middle of a romantic movie, and it was the most incredible feeling I had ever experienced. I couldn't believe that I was actually in her arms and that she still remembered my name. I was convinced that I had to be dreaming and that none of this was actually happening. I decided to just close my eyes and enjoy the moment, hoping the dream would last as long as possible. However, Sarah started shaking me and calling my name, sounding increasingly worried. I opened my eyes to see what was happening, and to my utter shock, she suddenly scooped me up in her arms. I was completely speechless as I found myself being carried by her in the middle of the street. I just stared at her in disbelief, thinking about how beautiful she looked even from that awkward angle. I was so confused and could only wonder if she was actually serious about carrying me. I wished more than anything that I was still dreaming because of how embarrassing the whole thing was. She looked over at the traffic light, and I realized that it had just turned yellow. She had been crossing the street when I stumbled toward her and collapsed. She must have thought I had actually passed out, and since the light was changing, she decided to carry me to safety. It only took a few seconds for her to carry me to the sidewalk and lean me against a building. She kept calling my name and checking to see if I was okay. I pretended to slowly wake up and asked her what she was doing there. She looked relieved to see me awake and asked if I was suffering from a low blood sugar episode. I told her that was probably the case since I hadn't had breakfast yet. She asked if I had any food on me and then pulled a couple of candies out of her pocket for me to eat. Before I could say anything else, she told me that I should take better care of myself instead of standing out in the sun without eating. Her voice was soft and full of concern, which made me blush with embarrassment. I was suddenly struck by the realization that she somehow knew exactly how long I had been standing there. I felt a wave of panic as I realized she must have noticed me standing there all morning. I nervously asked her if she had actually seen me the whole time. She looked a little embarrassed herself and said that it was easy to spot people since it wasn't a very busy day. She then tried to give me an out by asking if I was looking for something I had lost. I quickly agreed and told her that I had indeed lost something very important to me. She immediately offered to help me look for it while I sat down and rested for a bit. I wanted to tell her that she was the thing I was looking for, but I just told her that it wasn't a big deal and I could find it later. I thanked her again for all her help and kindness. I asked her if she was finished with her shift and suggested that I should take her to dinner to show my appreciation. I was so relieved to finally have an excuse to spend more time with her. She gave me a polite response about doing her job, but I told her that it was different since she was about to be off duty. I argued that once she was done with work, she was just Sarah, and I wanted to treat her as a friend. She seemed surprised by my words for a moment before telling me that I could just call her Sarah. I felt a surge of excitement and quietly repeated her name back to her. I couldn't wait to tell Jake everything that had happened when I got home. He gave me a knowing look and teased me about how happy I seemed to be. I told him that while it was only a small change, it felt like a huge step forward for us. Jake encouraged me to keep going and promised that I would win her heart in no time. Changing the way I addressed her felt like a major milestone in our relationship. I started calling her by her first name with a more personal tone whenever we spoke. I started sending her cute messages asking for restaurant recommendations, using the playful tone that Jake had suggested. He was convinced that this approach was the best way to get her attention. We ended up having a very long and passionate debate about the best way to make dipping sauce for hot pot. I eventually decided to ride my scooter over to her intersection after I finished work for the day. One of her colleagues asked me why I wasn't wearing a helmet while riding my scooter. I looked at Sarah and told them that I just wanted to be able to talk to her more easily, which made everyone laugh. Sarah looked a little embarrassed in front of her coworkers, but maintained her professional demeanor. She told me that she still had to give me a $30 ticket for not wearing my helmet. I apologized and told her that I would make sure to wear it in the future. I added that I was more than happy to cooperate since they were just doing their jobs to keep everyone safe. I paid the ticket without any complaints and gave her a playful wink to show that I was being a good citizen. It turned out that she actually felt a bit bad about giving me the ticket, and she messaged me later that night. She apologized for the ticket and told me that she had to follow the rules regardless of our friendship. I assured her that I wasn't upset at all and that I completely understood her position. I used the ticket as an excuse to ask her out again, suggesting that she should let me vent about it over some food. Jake was amazed by how quickly I was making moves and watched me leave with a look of pure shock. I felt like we were so close to becoming a couple, but neither of us seemed willing to make the final move. I even tried to stop messaging her for a while to see if she would reach out, but she never did. I wondered if she was playing some kind of game with me by staying silent. On top of that, Jake announced that he was moving out of our apartment to live with his girlfriend. I was actually quite sad when the day finally came for Jake to move out. He gave me a supportive pat on the shoulder and gave me some last-minute advice like a protective older brother. He told me that I was on my own now, but that he would always be there if I needed a wingman. I was touched by his words until he told me not to call him after 9 o'clock because he would be busy. One night, I was walking home late after a long shift and felt completely exhausted. The streets were almost empty at that hour, and the neighborhood felt unusually quiet and creepy. I wasn't scared at first, but I eventually noticed that someone was following me. Every time I slowed down or stopped, the person behind me would do the exact same thing. My heart started pounding, but I tried to act like I didn't notice anything as I picked up my pace. I muttered something about how cold it was and started walking as fast as I could toward my building. I ran inside and immediately locked the door behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. I couldn't stop thinking about the possibility of someone being hidden inside the apartment, which only made me more terrified. Suddenly, I heard a faint laughing sound coming from just outside my front door. I felt a chill run down my spine and stood perfectly still as I tried to figure out where the noise was coming from. I looked through the peephole and saw a man in a hat standing there with a very creepy smile on his face. I made sure the door was securely locked and immediately called Sarah for help. I was nearly in tears as I begged her to come and help me. I told her that a man had followed me home and was standing right outside my apartment door. Sarah's tone immediately became very serious, and she told me to stay on the line while she headed to my location. I gave her my address and could hear her rushing to get ready as she stayed on the phone with me. She made sure that I had all my doors and windows locked and promised me that she would be there as fast as she could. Hearing her calm and steady voice really helped me to settle down and feel safe. I burst into tears as soon as Sarah arrived at my apartment. I was terrified by the experience, but I was also overwhelmed by the fact that she had come to my rescue so quickly after not talking to me for weeks. I sobbed about how scary the man was and asked her why she had ignored me for so long. As I was complaining, I realized that she had pulled me into a very warm and comforting hug. She apologized and explained that she had been away for a training program where she wasn't allowed to use her phone. She reminded me that she had mentioned it during our lunch, but I had obviously forgotten. I eventually pulled away from her, feeling a bit shy about the whole thing. I started wondering why she had hugged me in the first place and if she did that for everyone she helped. I jokingly asked her if that was how she treated everyone who called for help. She just laughed and reminded me that most people don't call a traffic officer when they are being followed. She told me that she hadn't come there as a police officer, but simply as herself. She moved closer and looked at me with an expression that was incredibly tender and affectionate. I asked her what she meant, and she leaned even closer, asking if I really hadn't figured it out yet. She brought up the very first thing I had ever said to her and told me that her answer was finally yes. I didn't actually remember what I had said, but Jake had told me all the details from that night. I was stunned to realize that I had actually managed to find a girlfriend through such a ridiculous situation. I hugged her and asked if she had started to like me while I was watching her at work. She told me that wasn't it, and she also denied that it was because of my aggressive behavior on the street. I jokingly asked if it was when I was shouting about my 8-pack and good looks. She just laughed and pinched my cheek, leaving me with a mystery that I would happily spend the rest of my life trying to solve. Not long after, a drunk driver tried to lunge at Sarah while she was on duty. Remembering her training, she didn't hesitate to use a shoulder throw to pin the man to the ground. I told her how proud I was of her for handling the situation so well. She laughed and told me that my own behavior had been used as a training example so many times that she knew exactly what to do. She pulled me back toward her and told me with a beautiful smile that I was the only person she would ever be soft with. I realized then that she was always going to find a way to win my heart. Real chemistry isn't about playing games or using clever tricks. While you spent that entire week hanging around the intersection trying to be smooth, she had already fallen for your awkward sincerity and kept every clumsy moment tucked away in her heart.